Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Divorce Support Club. The Divorce Support Club is offered by Walker Family Law as an additional service to their legal services to offer something more than simply legal. So we offer you a safe, informal place to ask any questions that you might have, to gather a toolkit to help you manage your emotions, get clarity around the things that might worry you or scare you, and focus on what you can do so that you can feel stronger and more confident. We also discuss strategies for you to take back your power, perhaps challenge your negative thinking, and focus on taking positive steps forward. My name is Claire Macklin. I'm a breakup and divorce coach. I'm a qualified coach, and I've been divorced twice, which I'll talk about in a little while. I'm also single mum to two boys, although they're now 20 and 18, so maybe they're men. I've also been a second wife and a stepmom as well, so I've lots of experience to bring to these sessions. I'm also the author of Breakup from Crisis to Confidence, which is a book full of strategies to support you through a breakup. And I'm joined today by Lauren Preedy. And Lauren, would you like to very quickly introduce yourself?
Yes, hello Claire. Welcome everybody. Welcome to the new people that may be joining us, and also welcome to people that have joined the Divorce Support Club before, which we've been running for some time now. And as you may know, different themes link in with each other. And today we're here to talk about things that you've learned from your divorce. So I'm a solicitor and I'm a collaborative lawyer and currently the chair of Somerset Resolution. I've been qualified for about 20 years, I think, coming up, and or at least doing this job for 20 years. I might have been a trainee for part of it. And I have been divorced once, and I'm remarried as of a couple of months ago. And I'm a stepmom to two children, a girl and a boy, aged 11 and 8.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Lauren. Before we get into the main content, just a little bit of housekeeping. So we do have a chat box at the bottom of the screen. If you would like to message all panelists on that, you can ask any questions that you might like to ask, and we'll do our very best to answer them during the session. So let's get going into the content for today. So when I was thinking about this, I was thinking, every divorce is very different. Um, Divorce is always an emotional decision, and then there's a legal process to sort of unpick everything. And for many people, and certainly for many of the clients that I see, and certainly for myself, it was one of the most traumatic and painful things that I've been through. But there is a huge amount that we can take from it, that you can learn from it. And I'm a massive believer in, it's not what happens to you that makes the difference, it's what you do about it that makes the difference. So we thought we'd divide today into four sections. The first section is what Lauren and I have perhaps learned about ourselves through this process. The second section is around what we've learned about relationships. The third is around what we've learned about family and friends, and those relationships in particular. And then lastly, we thought we'd talk a little bit about parenting, co-parenting, and Lauren can talk a little bit about step parenting as well. So when I was thinking about this, I was thinking, what have I learned about myself during these processes? So I've been divorced twice. The first one was very sudden, very brutal. In its starting, anyway, it was very brutal. My husband came home from work and was a bit quiet, so I asked him over dinner if he was okay, and he said, "No, I've been seeing someone else." And that was the moment at which life changed for me the first time. So over the months that followed, I had to learn how to do all sorts of things. I had to pick myself up because it absolutely floored me. It came like a freight train out of nowhere, and I had no idea that he was unhappy. Um, so that's the story of my first divorce. My second one was very different in that it was my choice. And one of the big things that I learned through that was that when you are the person choosing divorce, it doesn't make it any easier. It's hard, but in different ways. So that's sort of my background. Lauren, would you like to tell us just a little bit about your divorce story?
Yes, yeah, of course. And I suppose that's also one of the things for me that in my day-to-day job, it's not necessarily something that I talk about much, obviously, to clients, but of course I'm always happy where necessary to share. And of course we all learn as humans as well how we can how to help other people, as well as, of course, my main job being there to be the solicitor and to give the legal advice, which is where I think it's important as well to point out, Claire, of course, that we work together to provide that extra service for clients to come to see you. And there's, of course, other professionals that could need to assist as well. So my story is that I'd been together with my ex-husband since we had basically come out of university, and over time drifted apart. I considered it to have turned into a friendship that was no longer what I wanted from a marriage. And we parted it was very difficult, as you said, and painful, but I had instigated that. But we were able to communicate about it being the right decision for us both after a period of time.
Yeah, so very, very different stories all round. So I think let's both then think about, what's perhaps the biggest things that we've learned about ourselves and how we operate from this. And one of the biggest things that I learned, particularly from my first divorce, was that I am way more resilient and way stronger um, than I thought I was. I learned that I can do really hard things, and I learned that I'm somebody who wants to survive. I was somebody who refused to think underneath this. So coming out of that, I learned that I could cope with pretty much anything that life threw at me. And I created a kind of toolbox to help myself to feel better. And I think that within that, there were three really important things that I learned. And the first one was something I learned from somebody else. So somebody really wise said to me really early on in my first separation, work out what you can control and focus on that. And that was brilliant advice, because it's really easy when you're going through a divorce or a separation to focus on the very thing that you can't control the most, your ex-partner, and to try and make them different, or to try and influence how they are behaving, or to try and stop them from doing things. So one of the big things for me around that, and that I talk about with a lot of clients actually, was I realized I couldn't stop my ex-partner introducing the children to his new partner. I couldn't do anything about it. I could speak to him about my worries if he would listen, but I couldn't actually stop him from doing anything. Um, and once I realized that and worked out that I had to let go of that, things became quite a lot easier for me. And I don't know if that resonates with you, Lauren.
Yes, it does, and I suppose that linking in with that as well is it's um the practicalities of certain things as well as the emotion. And I think one of the things I learned was that you can't expect it to be easy. As in, it's almost as though, especially if you're talking to people and getting opinions from other people as well, that they say, "Oh, you should be able to do that easily." Well, you might not be able to. Some things are going to be hard, and in particular, I found it's an adjustment I found to almost making decisions in conjunction with another person, to then having to make decisions on your own, which can be hard to do, to not have that person to bounce ideas off, or to help you. But also very liberating to be able to do that on
Yes,
your own.
yes,
So
I found that too. There are some decisions that that I kind of felt that I preferred to make with somebody else. So sometimes parenting decisions might fall into that. But then there were other parenting decisions that I would think, oh, thank goodness I can just make my own choice about this now. I don't
yeah,
have to um, compromise on some things anymore.
yeah. Well, just an example is, so my car got written off. I was coming down a slip road and somebody ploughed straight into the back of me.
Mm.
So I had to go and find another car, and I went on my own. And I found this quite bizarre, obviously knowing not much about buying cars, but I'd done as much research as I could, and I'd budgeted and thought about what I wanted and but right at the last minute I thought, hang on a second, I'm buying a car on my own. So I rang my neighbour just to say I just wanted who I was friendly with. And just because I kind of at that last minute thought, oh, I just feel like I need to run this past someone. But
Mm.
actually afterwards I thought I didn't. I should have just trusted my own judgment. So
Yeah.
I learned from that. But actually you can kind of flip it around to say that you don't necessarily need to make decisions on your own. I would look at each example or each thing you're doing in the context of that one thing and not put pressure on yourself to do that, because we have got friends and family and professionals that can help us with these things, but it took me a while to learn to trust my own judgment.
Mm, yes, and I see that a lot with clients. And so quite often I'll ask my clients to make a list of all the really good decisions that they've made by themselves over the last sort of 4 or 5 months, especially when there's a big decision coming up that they're frightened about. You know, it might be a decision around the settlement, or it might be a decision around something financial, for example. So we look back and start to look at all the other decisions they've made that have been really good, and in conjunction with that, like you say, think about all the other people that they have in their circle that might be able to help with this. So that's another thing that I learned really, was that I didn't have to do everything on my own if I didn't want to, but I could choose. I could choose to ask somebody else for their opinion, or I could choose to trust my own instincts. And I think as time went on, I learned to trust my own instincts more and more.
Mm.
I think that's what you're saying, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, and
Yeah.
it can actually be. I can't remember whether we put whether this is in our next section or not. I might be skipping somewhat ahead. Um, is that it can be really overwhelming for lots of people, like giving their opinions. People like sticking their oar in and telling you things, and some of it's helpful and some of it's not, and it can be very difficult to navigate your way through that.
Yes, it can. And actually, that brings me on to something else that I learned, which is to always stop and breathe when you're feeling that kind of sense of overwhelm. And that might come from just you just have too many things to do today, or there's, the process is overwhelming, or you've got too much advice, like you say, from too many different people, and you're overwhelmed by some of the choices that you've got to make. Stop and breathe and just take a step back, you know, breathing in and breathing out, doing some box breathing. And box breathing is when you breathe in for 4, you hold for 4, you breathe out for 4, but you hold for 4, and you repeat it. And it brings a real sense of calm to your brain and helps soothe that sort of parasympathetic nervous system, to help take you out of fight, flight, freeze. Because it's really easy, isn't it, to feel like you're kind of a deer in the headlights when you're going through this process. So I learned to pause, which has been so valuable to me ever since. I think I was probably somebody who was quite impetuous before that. I can be a bit impulsive. I can make decisions on a whim. And my divorce taught me actually sometimes to take a step back, to slow down, to look at the bigger picture.
And we talk about this actually in a lot of different topics, don't we,
Mm,
about not reacting, either because you need the space to think a bit more carefully about it, or that we've all been there and where we've said something that we regret because we've
mm.
reacted on anger or sadness and then wished actually we'd been a bit more refrained before we sent something to somebody.
Yes, exactly. And so taking that pause can allow you to then think, who do I want to be in this? How do I want to show up? What's my what's my long-term goal here? So, for example, in my first divorce, I decided that I wanted to be dignified at all times. I wanted not to be that person who shouted at my ex-husband in the street. Yes, did do that a few times. But I didn't want to be that person. So I learned that how I showed up in every situation had an influence on how it turned out.
Mm.
So when I showed up angry, or in a heightened state of emotion, things went awry, shall we say. Um, and then when I replied, for example, to an angry email that he might send to me with another angry email, then things would escalate. So I learned to take that step back, and I learned how I showed up actually was really important. And then that carried on through into my second divorce as well, when I decided that really what I wanted to do was to be steady and firm, and to steer my own ship through. Um, so yeah, I think you're right. Your power lies really in the choices you make about how you are through this process. And I really learned that through both of mine. You mentioned something earlier about choices and preferences, I think. Should tell us a little bit more about that if you can, Lauren? You learnt about
Yes,
making
yeah.
preferences.
Yeah, I think that it's so sometimes when you're in a marriage, um that you sometimes I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it. Your preferences may be dimmed because somehow they combine together with the other person. I'm not explaining this in the most eloquent of manners, but and you may forget what your preferences are for things, and that kind of links a little bit with the decisions, but also just about nice things in life. Like you might have a preference to go to the theatre rather than to the cinema, but you always went to the cinema because the other person wanted to, and moving forward into your new normal life without your ex-spouse, you're allowed to make decisions and you're allowed to have preferences for yourself that might not be the same as someone else in your family. So I
Mm,
really learned that I'm allowed those preferences. And sometimes I struggled with it because I felt sometimes like I might have been being either a bit shallow or a bit selfish.
mm,
But actually, no, I wasn't. It's just I hadn't got into that mindset that I was allowed to be that person that I wanted to be.
mm. It's the way I always look at it is like when you're married, your kind of your roots intertwine. So there's a sort of a bit of a quote from Captain Corelli's mandolin, I think. Your roots, if you're two trees, your roots intertwine, and then it becomes quite difficult to know which ones are your roots and which are theirs, or which are perhaps the things that they enjoyed and you've enjoyed because they did, as opposed to them being something that was just for you. So I always
Mm,
encourage my clients to start looking at what brings them joy, what brings them pleasure, what do they actually enjoy on a daily basis, and to really commit themselves to doing those things. Even right at the early days of going through a separation, that can really help to sort of to help you focus on yourself at that point in time.
and also I think we've linked it at some point to moving forward and future relationships as well, and we'll come on to that. But your preferences for when you are maybe ready to look for a new relationship.
Mm. Yes, absolutely. So I think we've covered really now what we kind of learned, but I think that it might be helpful to give people just a few sort of ideas for questions that they might be able to ask themselves to help
Mm,
them with thinking about what they're learning about themselves. So some really good questions sort of to build this up might be things like what's within my control here and what's my part? What options do I have? Because if you feel like you've only got one, you're stuck. If you feel like you've got two, then you've got a dilemma. And three actually gives you a choice. And one of the things that it's really good to bring back and to learn about yourself is to give yourself choices so that you feel that you're making conscious decisions. And that can be really empowering. So what choices do I have? You might like to ask yourself, what have I achieved in the last week or month that I'm really proud of? And what am I grateful for? Um, and also be really honest with yourself on this preference point. What would I prefer here?
mm.
What actually listen to yourself and think, what would I prefer if there was no one else involved in this decision at all? What would my preference be? And really sit with that. Maybe do some journaling around it.
And one of the things that I think is one of my favorite things to think about just generally as well, and in other topics as well we've talked about, is the gratitude and what you're proud of, because it's really easy for your brain to go into fast forward mode and be thinking about next week, next month, next year. Whereas actually, again, taking that deep breath and slowing down and thinking about the day and what you've achieved and what you want to achieve tomorrow, as opposed to um, kind of letting it all spit out of control, which is really easy to do.
Yeah, and that point about actually thinking back about what you're proud of and what you've learned will really help you to take the next steps forward. Because again, it's really easy for us to kind of look up the mountain of going through a divorce and think, oh my God, this is awful and really hard, and there's so many decisions to make. But actually, if you turn around and look back at where you've come from and what you've done already, you can think, wow, look what I've already done, look what resources I've used, look at the people who are surrounding me, look at the decisions I've already made, and
Mm.
that then helps you to be able to face that mountain again. So let's move on to thinking about what we might have learned about relationships and perhaps communication. So I spend a lot of time with clients talking about patterns that they might have followed, which are no longer serving them. and that they perhaps might like to change. So just as an example, for me, I avoided conflict. So in my previous relationships, I would sweep things under the carpet, didn't raise stuff that upset me or irritated me. And all that happened, looking back, I can see all that happened was that I became more upset, more irritated the next time. And actually, what I learned was that I was then depriving my partner of actually hearing how I felt. And I removed from them the option of understanding or changing. And I was removing the option of us actually discussing anything and finding a compromise position. So my fear of conflict actually was getting in the way of our relationship growing.
Which,
And that was
funnily
a
enough,
massive thing for me
I was
to
the other
realize.
way round.
Oh, that's interesting. Go on.
Yeah, so I think that I was a bit too confrontational.
Right.
Whereas my ex-husband's communication style was needing more time to consider things,
Mm.
not having something discussed there and then without having that opportunity. So I think that I the other way round, I denied him the ability to have more thinking time. And actually we were able, and I know that this isn't possible in lots of people's circumstances, we were able at some point to sort of have the discussion about how we clashed with the communication style, which was quite helpful because um, try I since then I've tried to bear that in mind actually, and learned that actually that's not necessarily the right thing to do.
Yeah, so we've often spoken, or we've spoken before in these sessions about um, this kind of seeing things from different
Mm,
perspectives. And I think that that's probably important to raise here. So it's really easy, isn't it, to make assumptions about the other person's motivations or feelings,
yeah.
um, and see things only through our own eyes, our own experiences, our own perhaps model of communication that we might have learned from our family when we were growing up. You know, some families are very, they might fall out and have a big shout at each other, and then it all calms down and everything goes back to normal. In other families, that would be just they just wouldn't do it, and everything would be very quiet. Or there are
Yeah.
lots of different models that we learn as we grow up. So I think it's a really good idea to, and this might have been something that you might have liked to have done actually, thinking back in your first divorce, is to sit down with a piece of paper. And if there's something that you and your ex-partner are falling out about or arguing about at the moment, is to sit at one place at the table and write down how you feel. What are you seeing? What's your perspective? What do you see? What do you hear? What do you feel is going on? And then you stand up and you shake that off and you go and sit at another chair with a different pen and a different piece of paper. And you write the same kind of thing, but from your ex-partner's point of view. What are they seeing? What are they hearing? What are they feeling? What do they believe is going on? What are their motivations? And you really have to try and put yourself in their shoes.
Mm. And an
And then
example.
shake it off again. And if necessary, you could sit and do it from your children's perspective. And then the final really important one actually is to sit and look at it from the perspective of somebody who has an overview of all of you. So somebody
Mm,
who's supportive and who's just heard you, who's just heard your ex-partner, and who's just heard your children. And what would they notice looking in from the outside? And I do this with clients a lot, and it can really make a difference to how people understand each other and to that how they then approach conflict and communication.
mm. Yeah, what I was going to say in the context of when I worked at a law firm in Bristol, obviously this is in relation to communication in the workplace, but I think things can still be applied. Is that it was a one of these studies of different behaviours that different people have, and you had to answer a series of questions, and then it plotted your personality, if you can put it like that, on a graph.
Mm.
And the person that I happened to be sat next with was just by coincidence the polar opposite of me on the graph. And you were invited to discuss each other's results and what you thought of each other. And he thought that I was overly nosy, and
Hmm.
I thought that he was a bit rude.
Right.
because he was much more reserved than I was. So I was asking questions thinking he wasn't answering. Was it because he couldn't be bothered to speak to me? And then we ended up having a laugh about it because the fact that we'd ended up sitting next to each other and we're exactly the opposite on the
Mm.
graph. So I really learned a lot that day just from talking to him actually. I didn't know
That's
him.
so interesting.
He worked in a different office. I'd never met him before. So
How
it was,
interesting.
yeah, really interesting. And again, it gave me that overview of, well, hang on a second, you're assuming something.
Mm.
And that's the thing, isn't it? Don't assume it makes an ass of you and me.
I was about to say exactly that. Yeah. Don't assume it makes an ass of you and me.
Yeah.
Quite. So a really good question to be asking yourself actually, um, is am I making an assumption here? And
Yes.
so I've really taken this into, I have a new partner now, and I've taken all of these learnings into that. So now, if if I have something that upsets me, I will say so, but I'm quite careful about how I do it. So rather than saying, you always do this or whatever, I will say, well, I noticed that when you did that, I felt this, and it didn't feel very good. Can we just talk about it? And being curious rather than furious,
Oh,
I
yes, I've
find
heard you say
really
that before.
helps.
I think that's a really great thing to think.
Yeah, it helps me to focus on trying to understand his perspective as opposed to trying to defend myself or attack. And it means that we both feel safe in that space. And actually, then you can have some much more, might
Mm.
be very difficult things to talk about. You can talk about them in a less conflictual way, and then it contributes towards growth. So that's been a major learning for me
Mm.
around relationships.
When
Um,
we were planning this session, Claire, we were
mm,
talking, weren't we, about how vast it could be, hence
mm.
the four kind of sections that we'd hoped we could talk about. Have we veered into the next section now? Do you think what we've learned about relationships and communications?
Oh yes,
Yep.
yeah, we've got
Just
we've gone straight into there.
I'm trying to make sure that we either don't miss anything or don't keep our viewers here listening to us for 3 hours because we could talk so much about it. So I'll let you lead the next bit we're on to.
Yeah, no, we're right in the middle of the stuff around relationships and communication. Um,
Brilliant.
so I know that one of the things that you mentioned when we were planning this was around black and white thinking and
Yes.
how that's manifested in for you in terms of communication. Would you tell us a little bit about that then?
Yeah, so this from my reading and also from some therapy I've had before, um that tends to be something that I um either look at it one way or the other, which links back to what we were just saying about there isn't necessarily just a right and a wrong way. There's a degree of lots of different things in between. And the other thing that I had a tendency to do um as we were separating and during the separation itself and actually I have to think about it now in all different kinds of contexts of my life is catastrophizing of I suppose a human habit maybe you could say to think of the worst case scenarios when you're under stress or especially under emotional stress. So I have to remind myself that that's unlikely to happen, that the black and white's unlikely to happen. And as I was going through the separation process, that all of it was somewhere in between, which is
Mm.
really difficult to do, I think.
Yeah, catastrophizing is something that comes up a lot in sessions that I have with clients. So, and you're right, it's a human thing. So our brains are hardwired to look for threat. And so when you're going through a separation or a divorce and you're worried about your financial future and you might be worried about your children and you might be worried about where you're going to live and you might be worried about how you're going to pay your bills or whatever it is, there's lots of things to worry about potentially. Your brain can go into sort of this fight, flight, freeze um, situation where it's on high alert all the time. Now, that was when we were, thousands and thousands of years ago, that fight, flight, freeze response to threat is massively useful because the threats might actually be things that could kill us. But that threat
Mm.
would appear and then go away, and then your body can recover back down to normal. when you're going through a separation, the threat is around you. It can feel like it's around you all the time. You know, you don't know what the future looks like. You don't know how it's going to pan out. You don't know how much money you're perhaps going to have. You may not know where you're going to live. And so your body can be in fight, flight, freeze almost permanently with lots of cortisol rushing around. And so, yes, it's really easy to think of the worst case scenario. So I like to talk about with my clients the what if tree. So the what if tree is this tree that you water with your thoughts. If you're watering your what if tree with catastrophizing thoughts, you know, what if the worst thing could happen? You're going to create a big shady tree that doesn't allow the sunlight through and nothing can grow underneath it. If you can start to flip your thoughts around and rather than thinking of worst case scenario, think, what if that doesn't happen? What if I'm okay? What if I manage to negotiate a really great settlement? What if my children are absolutely fine? What if I use all the resources I have? And so on. You water your what if tree with different thoughts and you create a different tree that allows the sunlight to come through and grass and flowers and things can grow underneath it. But it does take some practice to do.
Mm.
You have to concentrate first of all on thinking, okay, I need to flip that thought round. What if that doesn't happen?
Yeah. And the other thing as well that might be useful to point out, and we've talked about it before, and what we learn about ourselves is when we've talked about like kind of being kind to ourselves and how best to help ourselves. Well, and you know, Claire, from our discussions together, I am a very visual person, so certain visual images um really stick with me. So an image like that really helps me to think, and I remember it, and I remember. Whereas some people like to hear things, don't they? And some people like to read things.
Yes.
And I think again, if you have a preference in one of those ways of communicating, particularly also with with the work that you do with clients, but also the work I do with clients, I have some clients that prefer to have telephone conversations, and some clients that prefer to have emails because they each communicate in different ways. So as part of your process of learning about the separation, you're also learning about yourself and learning with the help of your professionals as well.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yes. And learning sort of what is your preferred kind of style of communication. And if once you've worked that out and you know, communicate it to your lawyer, for example, so
Mm,
that they know the best way to be able to contact you and so on. Um, and it would be really interesting, wouldn't it, to be able to think about that in the context of conversations that you might have with your ex-partner. You know, think about what you know about them and how they communicate best. And then think about how you could communicate in a way that is going to make it easier for both of you, if that's possible. One of the other things we talked about as well was it- it's easy as well to focus on all the things that you dislike about your ex-partner or your
yes.
you know what you dislike about their behavior. Um, and then to go for somebody who's completely the opposite when you move on into a new relationship. And I think both of us, when we were talking about it, it became quite clear that both of us have fallen down that into that trap, and both of us have thought about that since and decided that you know actually there were some things about our ex-partner that we did like and we did value. Um, so yeah, would you like to tell us a little bit more about your experience of that, Lauren?
Yes, of course. So is the expression, I feel like I'm coming out with lots of expressions in my mind today. Is it out of the fire, out of the frying pan into the fire? I think
Yeah.
I think it's that thought of um that I want to meet some, you reach a stage where, well, you may or may not, but you want to meet somebody else after your separation, and to jump to think, well, that person liked football, I better go out with someone that liked rugby. I know that's a silly example, but to actually think, well, no, because I liked football as well. Why would I go for a total opposite person when actually that's my hobby too? And I found that I moved into a relationship that actually ended up being pretty disastrous because that person's characteristic and personality was really overbearing and really not suited to me.
Mm.
whereas I'd gone from one extreme to the other, I think is the best way of describing it. So I think it's really being careful and acknowledging your allowed preferences, which we've talked about, but also looking and thinking, well, no, I'd like a person that is like them in that way. Because actually the likelihood is when the pain has gone, it's much easier to then see those really good qualities that um your ex-partner had. And in actual fact, when I talk now about my ex-husband, um, actually, I find it difficult to say anything awful. Well, I wouldn't want to, but I find it difficult to. I'm sure at the time I probably thought certain things, but he had a lot of awfully great qualities, and
Mm.
that I can respect and want in my new relationship.
Yes, yeah, I totally agree. And my first relationship after my first marriage was dissolved was equally disastrous, perhaps, as yours. I thinking back, I like my ex-husband is very sociable. He's really bright, and actually he has integrity, and I admire those things about him. But my next partner, I went for somebody who was very sort of he didn't really like going out. He didn't drink at all. Or these kinds of things that it just didn't suit me. I'm very sociable. I like to go out. I've got a big group of friends, and it's really important to me to keep in touch with them. And that became difficult in that new
Mm.
relationship after. So yeah, so I think, it is worth having a think about before you go into anything new, what it is you do and don't like. And being very aware of not going for just the opposite. And
But
actually that
if
gone.
oh, I was going to say if something disastrous does happen emotionally, that actually don't give yourself a hard time about it, because it is really difficult. And depending on how long you may have been in your marriage, I mean, it might have been decades before you've had to think about a new relationship. And that's, I mean, we haven't got time to go into how scary and overwhelming that could possibly be, but also to not give yourself a hard time about it. And you're going to learn from those experiences as well.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think we probably need to move on to thinking about
Mm.
family and friends. There's so much more we could say on all of these. We should have done 4 different webinars, but what we've learned about family and friends, I think the biggest thing that I learned was that it isn't always the people you think who are going to be there, and there are some surprising people who pop up out of the woodwork who really are there for you. So not to be surprised by that.
Mm.
Um, I think there were some people who I was quite disappointed by, and other people who were perhaps on the periphery of my friendship groups when my separation started, but who became very central and who became really, really important. And I think, well, we've talked about this before, but this concept of radiators and drains
Mm.
becomes really important. Thinking about who are your people who lift you up, who are the people that support you, as opposed to the people that drain you. And I know you really like the energy vampire
Yes, and
phrase.
I haven't I must look it up and to say it for on the next time, is that there is a book about energy vampires, and I can't remember who the author is. And it's, yeah, I really, it can be really difficult to end relationships that are friendships, and that's a whole different a
Mhm.
whole different podcast as well, isn't it? but
Yeah.
but actually, if those people are really having a toxic effect on your life, and well, your marriage may have been having a really toxic effect on your life, then of course there's also really difficult challenges central to that as well.
Mm.
And I kind of felt that I tended to overshare until I learned that that might not be the best thing to do.
Yes, me too. So I think one of the things I learned was that the importance of choosing carefully what you share with people, who you share with and how much you share with them. And that it's okay to say to people, I don't actually want to share that. I don't want to talk about it. I would like to talk about something else. People find that really difficult, I think. The other thing I learned was that I was going to hear lots and lots of different opinions, and the if I were you brigade could be a little bit dangerous in that they might say, well, if I were you, I'd do X, Y, and Z. If I were
Mm,
you, I'd appoint this Rottweiler lawyer over here, or I would, I would refuse to let the children go because of X, Y, Z. That kind of thing. Those people aren't you, and they don't have to live with the consequences of what they might advise you to do. So, just be really careful about whose advice you take, I would say.
mm.
Um, Social media comes into this as well, doesn't it? I think a bit, Lauren. Not airing your dirty laundry on social media. Um, I learnt that social media was probably something to stay off while I was going through my separation. It was a bit like torture. Um, and I have lots of clients who find it really difficult to switch off from perhaps following their ex-partner, or seeing their ex-partner's post on Instagram or whatever. My advice always is to not do that.
Yeah.
I learned that it was better to take a really big step back from all of that.
And the other thing as well is that it can legally impact things if you're posting things that could then be against what you've perhaps said to your partner, or if there is any issues to do with the children, and somebody's posting things, then again that could have an adverse impact there. But also it's just putting those boundaries in place, I think. And again, it's human nature to kind of want to see what people are doing. But is that helpful? Probably not. And one of the things that I also learned, and over the years, because it's been a long time, well, I think eight years since I got divorced now,
Mm.
is that some friendships slowly ended because they
Yeah,
were friendships that had been linked to my ex, and but again, due to life, distance, work, certain friendships did fizzle out somewhat, or became much more kind of send birthday cards but you don't get together like you used to, or something like that. And actually it still fills me with a bit of sadness,
yeah,
but I accept that sadness because I know that it it can't be any different in some ways. But again, it's the sitting with those difficult emotions, isn't it? And knowing
yeah.
that it might be a decision you've made, which is the right decision, or actually it's a decision you haven't made.
Mm.
But
Yeah,
again,
those can be the really tough ones, can't they, as well? And I learned that when so there were some friends who perhaps stayed more friendly with my ex-husband than they did with me. Um, that kind of thing, or invitations stopped coming from certain groups of people to do things with them, or things like that. And one big thing I learned was that actually wasn't anything about me per se. It was usually something to do with them. So there was, it sometimes couple friends, it might hold a mirror up to their own relationship when your relationship breaks down, or
mm,
they might not be able to stay friends with you and your ex-partner. There are all sorts of reasons, but they're generally not really about you. Those decisions that other people made were not about me per se.
mm. But I actually ended up in a slightly I say an odd thought process once, because I got invited to a party which would have just been me, and I I expected that my ex would have been invited, but he was in a relationship. But the group of people that were going to be there, I had also known since I was 20. And I didn't want his new partner to feel awkward if I was there. So in a way, my mindset switched the other way round, which surprised me, because I wasn't thinking it more of me being there on my own. I was thinking that I wouldn't want that other person as the innocent party, if you can put it like that,
Yeah,
to be in an awkward position either.
yeah, yeah.
Which again,
That's an interesting one, isn't it? Because actually, you can perhaps speak to the host or whatever and raise that, but ultimately, that's not your thing to own.
no, no. And that's kind of another thing I had learned, that sometimes you do get these odd thought processes, and why would you think that, and how can you help yourself? And
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's really interesting. The other thing I learned about um family was that just because we got divorced, I wasn't getting divorced from the wider family. So I'm still very good friends with my ex-sister-in-law, and various other members of his family, and that's okay. Um, you know, sometimes sometimes he might have not have appreciated that to a degree, but I've been very careful never to, I don't impinge on their family get-togethers or anything like that, but I do maintain contact with his sister in particular. We're still good friends, and so actually you don't have to break contact with everybody within the family just because you are separating um
Mhm.
from
But
your
that's
partner.
one of the things, of course, that you might not be able to control, because
Yes,
those other people may choose not to remain friendly with you, mightn't they? And
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. There are so many wider ripples. And that's another of the things that I learned was, this wasn't just about our divorce. The relationships all around us
mm,
also shifted and changed. I think we probably should move on and think about children and co-parenting as well. So
yes,
I'm very conscious of the time. Um, and it'd be really interesting to get your perspective on this, Lauren, actually, as a step parent now, because some of the things that I learned about co-parenting in particular were, well, one of the things I learned about it was how challenging it can be. And I've had ups and downs with my children's dad, although on a general level we co-parent really, really well, but sometimes I can be quite infuriated by something that he does, and sometimes he can be quite infuriated by me.
mm,
um, so so I've used those stop and breathe and think strategies and that helicopter, thinking about all the different perspectives so many times. And it really helps me to kind of keep the children at the center. So one of the big things I learned really quickly was I needed to keep my eye on the long term, think about the long term, where I want to get to with my relationship with him as their dad. And that might be different to where I want to get to in my relationship with him as my ex-husband. And I think it's really important. I learned that I needed to separate those two things, separate him as my ex from him as my children's dad. And that was a really big learning for me.
yeah. Whereas, so my husband has got two children, 8 and 11.
Mm,
So, of course, the difference in the breakdown of both our relationships is that he this again is perhaps a crude way of describing it. I don't need to be in touch with my ex-husband. He needs to be in touch with his ex-wife because of the children.
yes.
And I think that however amicable it may or may not be, there is always going to be challenges, because there's always going to be differences of opinions about different things. And I've also, I think I'm lucky in the sense that I've experienced in my job helping people in all different scenarios and different types of family setups and step parents and single parents and um, all different kind of where people live and where they travel from and where they go to school. So I think I've able to be very sensitive about it. And also in my own friendship group, I've witnessed it the other way round, where young children of that are biologically my friends have had to go and are in relationships with step parents, and how challenging that has been. So I've always tried to just think about the children and doing the best thing for them, but also maintaining a degree of sensitivity of for both parties as to the fact that there is going to be that pang. And my husband's ex-wife has, as in we've spoken about it before, and of course she does have feelings that, oh, I wish I was going with the children and doing that, because again but she's pleased they're going and doing nice things, and pleased that they do have a good relationship with me. And I think
Mm,
that links back to what you said about separating the what's best for the children and actually what's best for you in a different context. So
yes.
It's
Yeah.
but I think that that there's always going to be, I would say, some tension at some point over something, whether it's school dinners, uniform, whether it's going to a party, who's picking up, who's dropping off. There's a whole array of things. And that links back to communication, and obviously depends on how old the children are as well, because there's obviously different challenges when you've got teenagers, and also different challenges when you've got adult children.
Mm. Yes, yes, absolutely. I think there's something really important there around the learning about the different roles that there are in this. And the roles can be your roles will shift from when you were married. So when you were married, perhaps you divided childcare in a certain way, or you there were certain things you did, certain things they did. But when you share care of your children, the roles are going to change. And sometimes what I've seen is that it sometimes gives one parent the opportunity to become more involved than they were before. And this can be so difficult, I think, for the other parent sometimes to accept. And it can be really hard. It takes a lot of adjusting, and it takes a lot of really putting the children's interests at the fore. I mean, we're not talking about situations here where there's any kind of abuse. Of course, I mean, really important to make
Yeah.
that clear. We're talking about perhaps situations where one parent perhaps has not done so much of the care outside of school, and suddenly they are going to be. And it can be a really difficult transition, and there are lots of difficult emotions to sit with in that. Um, but I think one of the big things to keep in mind at this point is that it's not divorce per se and shared care of the children per se that is damaging to children. It's when those children get caught in conflict between you that it does become potentially really damaging. And so some of the really big emotions that come up with this can be really hard and really painful and really difficult and challenging, but really worth looking at.
Mm, mm. And the other thing, I suppose, as well, is linking back to what we were saying about the good qualities of the other parent, because actually, if one person is very sporty and good at sport and the other person's very academic, then it might be that you do decide that certain people will take a certain role, and that doesn't mean that you're skirting away from responsibility. It's using the skills of the parents in the best way for the benefit of the children, is the way that I've looked at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if anybody wants more advice, anybody listening would like more advice or more guidance around this, then going back and listening to our session last month with Heather Rutherford would be a really good thing to do. We spent a whole hour talking about children and how to handle separation and divorce
Mm.
well with your children. So that I would definitely advise people to go and listen to that. Absolutely, one of the things that I learned through the process that I mean, I've been divorced now. My children were 1 and 3 when we first separated, and they're now 20 and 18, so it's a long time ago. And they've had their entire childhood with this. Um, and one of the things have really learned from this was that they haven't been damaged by our divorce because we have worked so hard to try and put our differences in terms of ex-husband and wife aside when we're talking about the children. I can't really emphasize it enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I think, to summarize, that I've learned about myself is that I actually became a bit more self-aware, which
Mm,
I've continued to kind of think about, and that was a good turning point for me.
yes, I think we're kind of going into a sort of overarching kind
Mm,
of
yeah,
thing now, but it's interesting you say that because I kind of see my life as pre-separation number one and post-separation number one. And I think I've learned more in the last 17 years than I learned in the 35 years that went before that,
yeah, yeah.
about myself and about people and about communication. Um, and without my separation and divorce, I doubt if I would have learned lot those things,
Mm,
if I'm honest, because I would have had no reason to look at them.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so it's absolutely made me who I am.
Yeah, yeah. Me too. I would agree and actually, you can look back and reflect on the good times and the bad times, and you're allowed to appreciate the good times, and you're allowed to reflect on the bad times. It's to not close your mind to that, I suppose. And the fact that it's happened and it didn't work out in the way you hoped doesn't mean you have to totally forget about it, which is often what people do say to me.
Yes, yeah, yes. There are lots of things that you can take from it. So I really hope that our conversation today has been useful for people listening. Um, if there are any questions that come up after and you'd like to drop either Lauren or myself a line, please feel free to do so. Um, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Lauren, and learning a bit more about you as a person
Yes,
through
you too, Claire.
having these discussions. And all that remains really for me to say is thank you for coming along, and thank you very much for sharing your experiences so openly, so that we can all learn from them. And then our next session is in October. I think it is the 16th of October. And we're going to be talking about menopause and divorce, and the link or connections or effects that that can have.
And
So
to point out at that stage, Claire, as well, of course, that it's not just aimed at women.
mm,
It's aimed at how the menopause affects divorce, which of course includes how the effect of menopause um, on men as well.
yes, absolutely. So all it remains for me to say is thank you very much, Lauren, and thank you everybody for watching, and we will see you next time.
Yeah, thank you.